Human, we're playing somebody same rating as me. Okay, let's go, e4. Alright. a6, that is new. I think we've faced this a couple of times before in the speedrun. The question is this a troll? Now, a6, b5 is, believe it or not, a pretty legitimate opening. It's known as the St. George's defense. And it's important for white to, it's important for us to position our pieces correctly, which is actually, believe it or not as trivial as it may seem. So the setup that I like to play against a6 is knight on f3, bishop on d3, and then the knight on b1 doesn't go out to c3 until later. In fact, we often put a pawn on c3. You guys know that I quite like that setup in general. When we go knight f3, bishop b7 is, of course, the main move for black. Okay, d6 is, I mean, I guess is possible. Doesn't really change our approach. I think is standard average. And this bishop comes out to d3. Why d3? So that it reinforces the e4 pawn. So that if black fianchettos, we don't really have to worry about this pawn becoming weak. Right? Now, what can you tell me about this b5 pawn? Is there any way that we could punish black for essentially playing a6, b5? Let's start by castling, by the way. Let's get castling out of the way first. This idea isn't going anywhere. Yeah, we can. And this is a positional idea that I think everybody over 1200 should be familiar with. You know, whenever there's pawns on a6 and b5, we have the possibility of going a4, and we can even do it here. We don't have to develop all of our pieces for this to be effective. And essentially, this challenges the pawn on b5, and c6 is a very typical mistake. That's already a blunder. And I'm sure that you guys see why. There's an x-ray going on here. So we can play a takes b5, c takes b5, and then bishop takes b5 check. The rook on a8 is undefended, so we win a pawn. a5, ugh. This is looking very, very ugly for black. Okay, I mean, we have multiple ways we can handle this. We can just leave the pawn on b5, but for the sake of simplicity, I propose just taking on c6. And in response to knight takes c6, I'm positive that some of you are probably tempted by bishop b5. But remember, you know, always try to evaluate pins for their long-term benefit. Don't just make a move because it looks good. Bishop b5, black plays bishop d7. And we haven't really achieved anything. So what move do I like to play in such positions? The knight and the bishop are both attacking only one thing. So it doesn't really make sense to go d5 because that expands the diagonal for the bishop. That justifies black's play. d5 justifies black's play by expanding the diagonal and giving the knight extra squares. Not bishop e3, but rather we play c3. Biting on granite. This is one of my favorite pawn constructions. Now look at how inefficient the bishop and the knight are. And now we can complete our development. So I propose getting this bishop out before we get the knight out. We can play bishop e3. We can also play bishop g5 just to prevent him from pushing his e-pawn. Him or her from pushing their e-pawn. And knight f6, knight bd2. We've completed our development. There is one more move that I would like to make, you know, which is part of the general rubric of completing our development. What am I talking about? This is a move that, you know, you just often play in many different types of positions. It's too early for e5. Let's not bother ourselves with these kinds of moves. Yeah, we can play h3, but the move I was actually talking about is rook e1. It's just a good idea in these positions because a lot of you are probably noticing that the possibility of going e4, e5 is very much something we should be considering. And the other thing we have time to do is to make some moves. Let's go h3. And the reason I'm not hesitating about these moves is just because we're up a pawn, we're incredibly solid, we can afford such positional niceties, right? We can afford to make these improving moves without really even a second thought. And now that we've improved our position essentially to the maximum, you know, now we can start thinking about taking more concrete steps to convert our extra pawn in our excellent position. So multiple ways of doing that, but we've already been discussing the e5 pawn break. Now, if you play e5 right here, then black takes with the pawn. And if you take back with the pawn, remember that when you push a pawn and attack a knight, you often relinquish your control over a certain square. In this case, the knight can hop back into d5. Not too enthralled with that concept. So what I like doing here is going knight c4. I like the concept of knight c4. Now after e5, d takes c5, we're going to take back with the knight. And if black takes with the knight, then we take with the other knight, and we're just going to have an absolute monster sitting on e5, attacking f7. So I much prefer to recapture our e5 with the knight. Does that make sense? Now, if black tries to beat us to the punch, then notice that the d6 pawn is going to hang. Okay, rook b8. Do we need to do anything about that? Well, let's calculate. The rook now stares down the b2 pawn. Can we play e5? So e5, de, knight f takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. Yeah, we can play it because rook takes b2, walks into knight takes f7. Remember that this pawn is now a forkable square. So the time has come for us to go e5. We don't need to get our queen into the game yet, right? This is misconception I've talked about. Doesn't matter which knight we take with. Let's take with this knight. Just because this knight on c4 hits on the a5 pawn, it defends b2. Common misconception yet again that we need every single piece in the game before we open up the center, for example. No. We'll get the queen into the game when the time comes, but right now the services of the queen are not needed. The pieces are doing a perfectly fine job handling the situation without the queen. Okay, so knight e5, knight e5, and now we're threatening f7. So b2 is untouchable. And notice also, I was about to say bishop e6 is very, very likely. And in such situations, you have a knight in the center. What do I always tell you to do? Look at potential forks, right? Don't just stop at one fork. Look at all potential forks. But there's a very interesting subtlety here that we need to factor into account. This is probably not going to be needed, but let's play accurately. What do I see here? Well, I'm noticing a slightly disturbing thing. The bishop on g5 is an undefended piece. Okay, well, what difference does that make? Well, it makes a very specific difference. After knight c6, black actually has quite an unpleasant defensive response. What am I talking about? Queen d5. Now, you might say, well, how does that help? We just take the rook. Well, if you take the rook, then black's queen captures our bishop on g5. Now, do you see why that could lead to a problem? It's still winning for white, but you should see that the knight on b8 is going to be hanging, and what else is black threatening in that position? Who can tell me? Who can tell me what else black is threatening after knight c6, queen d5, knight takes b8, queen takes g5? Yeah, black is threatening bishop takes h3. Now, is there a way for us not to allow that? Well, what do I even mean by that? The first place you should look is at the start, right? Maybe we can make a different move at the start in order to take away that possibility entirely, and we can take the knight on f6. That's pretty elementary, my dear Watson. Then we play knight c6, knight takes b8. There's no bishop to attack on g5. We'll speed up just a little bit here, under 4 minutes. Okay, so he did go queen d5, and this paid off tremendously. Okay, now we should defend b2. And, now finally we can do it with the queen. Our queen is currently not doing anything. Let's put it e2, c2, d2. It doesn't matter, okay? It really doesn't matter. Let's put it on e2. Let's put it toward the center. Now we're up in exchange, and the pawn this is completely winning. The rest is a matter of pretty simple technique, but I'll try my best to be accurate here. Okay, so how am I thinking of converting this? Well, first things first, I would love to trade one pair of bishops just to eliminate black's only trump card, which is his two bishops. So that's one thing I would consider. Okay, the other thing that I notice here is that the a5 pawn is a pretty significant weakness. It always has been, and currently it's only protected by the queen. So what move immediately comes to mind, right? Just by that observation alone, you should already consider this move. Yeah, bishop c4 kind of wins a pawn. It also skewers the f7 pawn, by the way, so which we might very well take. Okay, so bishop f7. Our opponent is defending quite resiliently, I have to say. Bishop takes h3. So we have a nice move here. I don't like queen f3 because it drops the b2 pawn. I don't really like queen f3. But we can amend that idea slightly. And rather than playing queen f3, we can play the move queen e3. Important idea, folks. Queen e3. Which poses black with an ultimatum. Either he declines the queen trade and gives us another tempo, which we could use to bring the rook up to e2. Or black takes on b2, but that means allowing a queen trade, which is totally unthinkable. You have to realize that queen trade is worth the price of the pawn. Now, there is an even better way of defending the pawn. Rook e2 still creates a situation where our rook is a little bit passive. The move I prefer is pawn b3. Now we have a completely self-sufficient situation here. We don't have to worry about this with any other of our pieces. And our rooks and our queens are, have wiped their hands of the task of defending b2 and can focus on more important things, such as attacking a5, which incidentally now is even more fixed than it was before. Now we're threatening to take on f7 here, which I absolutely will if given the opportunity. Okay, rook f8. We are not given the opportunity. Okay, well, instead, I think we will take this opportunity to start surrounding the a5 pawn. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to double rooks on the a file. That is the most traditional method of attacking a pawn that sits on an open file, right? Pretty simple stuff. Incidentally, we could also bring this a rook over to the e file if necessary, if the situation demands it. It's not like our rooks, you know, are banished to Siberia, right? That's an important thing to understand as well. Okay, this move doesn't really do anything concrete. It stares at the g2 pawn. It's important to notice that, but it's also important not to be afraid of ghosts. And this doesn't threaten anything at all. We can proceed with our plan. We also could have played the move d5, which intercepts the queen and the bishop. Okay, bishop g5. What is the best response to this move? Let's play accurately. Don't just move your queen back as an instinct. Really take a couple of seconds and really see where the queen should go. What is the nicest square? Yeah, queen e5 check is great because it's a check. And if black plays f6, he drops e7 with tempo. If black moves the king, then obviously we have now time to take on a5. So this is where playing just marginally more precisely is going to get you a lot of points because you're not going to lose on time. And you're just not going to spend as much time messing around if at the start you play more accurately. Now we trade queens. We're going to take on a5, and it's a totally winning position. Of course we'll trade. Yeah, no, here we're up 3 pawns, so it makes much more sense to trade than to not trade. Okay, and here our strategy is quite simple. We want to trade as much as we can. Now, how I would think of this position is I want to play rook a8, ideally. I want to play rook a8 now. We can't because there's a bishop on c6. Okay, well, you might say, well, does that mean we should play d5? Well, there is an even better move than d5. We can kill 2 birds with one stone. We can try to get this bishop off of this diagonal while also offering another trade. Bishop d5. Bishop d5 is just a buzzsaw, buzzkill. All right, because either the bishops are traded and then black is out of resources to contain our passers, or the bishop moves away and then we go rook a8 and the same thing happens, just with a different trade. Yeah, this is completely resignable and we've got plenty of time to win this. Okay, now the strategy is very simple. We are going to use the b pawn and we're going to promote it and we're going to force black to give up a bishop for that pawn. But let's not rush. First, we should activate our pieces to the maximum. What move does that entail? This move is going to make it a lot easier for us to push the pawn. Rook a8, rook a7. Yeah, get the rook to the 7th rank, hit the bishop. Always a safe bet. Now we've got both of our pieces on great squares. Let's start pushing b4. And this is a very easy matter of... Now here, generally, defending this square would be... What piece should be doing that? Right? Should we go rook b7, or is there a better way to do that? There is a better way to do that. Bishop c6, rolling out the red carpet, b5, b6, etc. And I'm expecting e6 with the idea of b5, bishop d8. No, it's just going to let us play b5. Fine. Have it your way. Don't worry, the time is... We've got more than enough time to win this 5 times over. And black is not even really making an attempt to stop the pawn. Okay. 7. Okay, bishop d2 is not even, I was going to say a mouse slip, but it's not. It just lets us promote. This would be winning with 5 seconds on the clock. Now, rook takes c7 is possible, but if you want to be totally clinical, what's the most accurate move here? What's the move that just like... What is the like Kasparov move here? Not rook a8, guys. No, get your queen to the center, right? Get your queen to the center, queen e5 check. To me, queen e5 check looks like the fastest path to checkmate because we're talking about semantics here, but it restricts the bishops and it sort of just prepares to get all of your pieces to mating squares. I don't know how to describe it. Then we can take e7 and go queen f6 if the king drops back to h6. I think a lot of people actually have trouble. Charlie had a lot of trouble with this, delivering checkmate once you've got a billion extra pieces. So I'm kind of joking, but I'm also not joking. And, you know, it's worth paying attention to how I'm doing this. Queen f6 check. And then after king h5, bishop f3 is checkmate in 2. Bishop g4, bishop takes g4. Goodbye. Let's take with a pawn just for the sake of aesthetics. Okay, so a6, obviously not the greatest opening in the universe, but also far from the worst. Of all of the corner pawn moves, a6 is undoubtedly the best. Pushing the h-pawn, I think, is incomparably worse. h6, g5, the mirror line on the other side of the board is basically losing because it creates too many kingside weaknesses. So, yeah, the setup I like is knight f3, and generally black plays bishop b7, bishop d3, e6. This is the main line, actually. And I guess you could check what, what people recommend on YouTube. I'm sure there are tutorial videos. Yeah, now castles. Black generally plays c5, and I like this setup, the sort of Alapin-esque setup with pawns on c3 and d4 and e4. You know? This kind of aesthetic I like. Very hard for black to do anything in regards to our center. Does that make sense? And the way that you expand your thinking here is, as you depart from beginner level, you have to understand, start becoming more flexible with piece development, right? Don't marry yourself to the idea of putting knights on c3 and f3 every single game. Understand that the knight on d2 can be just as effective. So I won't delve too far into the theoretical discussion here. d6, bishop d3 we played anyway. And a4, very important positional idea. Now, how should we respond in the event of b4? What should we do here? And there are several ways that we could play this, but there is one move I like to play in such positions, which is to prevent black from playing a5. Yeah, so one way we could do this is go c3. c3 is a great move here. And in the event of the trade, who does the opening of the b file favor? Well, it favors the player with the more active pieces, right? It's white. We have an easier job getting a rook to the b file than black does. But I also like the move a5 here, which prevents black from playing a5. And if black plays c5, I mean, he really overextends himself in this position. You know, this diagonal is, we can kind of see that this is very, very flimsy. Now the pawn on a6 is also kind of a long-term weakness. It's being stared at by the bishop. Okay. So again, not to delve too deeply into this, but just remember this concept of a4 when black has pawns on a6 and b5, and of course vice versa. C6 is just a blunder, a takes b5, and of course the point is bishop takes b5 check, and because of the x-ray, black is screwed. You can't take back. But a5 exacerbates the issue even further because it just creates another weakness. And at this point already, it's a very difficult position for black. Pawn down, weak pawn on a5. It's very, very difficult to defend such positions. Excelsior, yeah, I guess. Anyways, rook e1. Everything we did here should be completely clear to literally everybody. I mean, if you have any questions about why we played the way we did here, feel free, but hopefully it was pretty clear. Yeah, now knight c4, right? Preparing e5, but in the right way. This is a good thing to think about. If you have a pawn break, think about what it is that you want to recapture with, right? What piece do you ultimately want to end up on e5, right? Is it the pawn? Is it the rook? Well, usually the answer to that question, when in doubt, it's the knight. Is knights in the center are, in terms of pieces that are centralized, knights get the most return on investment when they're centralized versus other pieces. And that's why we go knight c4. e5. And this is a terrible position for black. He's already almost lost. More resilient would have been to play rook f8, obviously not missing the fork. But we would have gone bishop c4 quite possibly, and this puts more pressure on f7. This is a terrible position for black. Terrible. Bishop b6, the only important tactical moment in this game was bishop takes f6. Just a subtlety, right? And a lot of people would automatically play knight c6, but training yourself to pay attention to undefended pieces. And by the way, bishop takes f6 now, it's too late for that because black can now take the knight. But training yourself to pay attention to undefended pieces at all times and not rushing into tempting moves. I mean, that's really all that it takes, right? Because once I alerted you to the fact that black had resource here, everybody saw queen d5. Right? Once I told you, don't play knight c6 automatically, you guys saw this idea. But that's the key. You have to remember to train yourself to do that yourself. Okay, bishop f6, knight c6. And the rest of the game is, I think, quite clear without analysis. Queen e3 is a nice move. Defending h3, offering the queen trade. Weaponized queen trade, right? Using the queen trade as a weapon to force your opponent's queen off of a good square. And then doubling on the a file, hitting and targeting the biggest weakness. Muller, I saw your question the first time, but unfortunately that's an impossible question for me to answer because it is two questions of this nature until which elo is this decisive, that decisive. It's extremely relative. Losing a pawn is not a monolithic concept. Being a pawn down in a pawn endgame is completely different from losing a pawn in the opening, right? And losing a pawn in this opening is completely different from losing a pawn in another opening. So it's an unanswerable question because it really depends on where the circumstances in which you lose a pawn. But if I have to give you a ballpark, really under 1500, you shouldn't worry too much about losing a pawn. I would say once you hit 2000, that's when losing a pawn kind of becomes a disaster. And at my level, losing a pawn can just be instantly decisive. But even at my level, you can lose a pawn and recover. It's not like GMs convert every pawn up position. Not even every piece up position is converted by GMs. I mean, famously, Bronstein and Botvinnik played a world championship match where Bronstein won a rook and failed to convert it. So it's not like GMs are immune from difficulty converting positions. And I don't think of it that way. Like, oh, you hit this level and then you're never going to have trouble with any of this ever again. It's not how it works. David Bronstein, by the way, great player. Probably not as familiar of a name to most people in the chat. So this position occurred on the board. Botvinnik has just gone knight a4. Bronstein drops his bishop back to a7, blundering a very nice tactic. b6, bishop takes a4, b7. Look at this. And it's over. Bishop takes b3, you make a new queen. White is currently up in exchange, and both bishops are hanging at the same time. It's a completely winning position. And Bronstein said, I became terribly angry with myself, and instead of resigning the game, which is what the auditorium buzzing like a beehive was expecting, I gathered my nerves into a single ball and began quickly moving the remaining pieces as though nothing had happened. And so it turned out that one of the players was full of energy and was eager for a battle to the death, while the other had demobilized his will and was indifferently awaiting his opponent's resignation. That's a great quote. The subsequent course of the game showed just how important the psychological state of a chess player is. After all, the man with his weaknesses is the main thing in chess, the rest being merely pitiful attachments. I don't know what that means. I'd have to read the original. Queen b5. And Bronstein just activates his pieces. Let's flip the board. The queen a8 is not trapped. Black can't really trap it because it's got several escape routes, but it currently can untrap itself on its own. So Botvinnik kind of panics, right? The simple castle short would have won the game. Black just has one try. White tucks the king away on h1, and this is game over because it's only a matter of time before White extricates the queen. But Botvinnik decides to give up an exchange in order to get his queen out of the game. And he ends up also giving up the pawn on d5. And then he offers a queen trade, but he gives up another pawn to trade queens. And now Bronstein has built up a pretty impressive little pawn phalanx in the center. White is still winning, obviously. 2 pawns for the piece only, but Botvinnik failed to convert this endgame. I mean, it's a very interesting endgame. Ultimately, Bronstein just completely outplayed him. He just made a lot more progress than White. And at some point, Botvinnik even had losing chances. And here Botvinnik offered a draw in this completely unclear position where even Bronstein can try to play for a win. And this is one of a million of such examples that I could show you. And once we traded queens, the only other thing, bishop d5, right? Again, weaponizing the trade. Posing a completely devastating, I guess, ultimatum. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Kavita. You mean taking Black's knight, like this line, where we took the knight on f6? Like why the immediate knight c6 wasn't a good idea? Yeah, so here Black has queen d5. And first of all, if you say, okay, now I'll take on f6, and then I'll take the rook. No, that doesn't work anymore because Black doesn't have to take the bishop. Black can take the knight, And obviously the king defends the bishop. And white is still better. We're up a pawn, but not more than that, right? Number one. Number two, if you take on b8, black takes on g5, and the problem is that the knight hangs, and because of this x-ray, I'm sure you see that bishop takes h3 is a pretty nasty threat here. Now, it's not the end of the world, but another thing that hurts white is that if you move the knight back to c6, again the knight is undefended. So instead of bishop takes h3, black can even play bishop d5 even better, and this wins the knight because of the mate threat simultaneous with the threat of taking the knight, right? See what I'm saying? So it's just annoying. It's just very, very annoying. So you would have to play knight a6, presumably, and then you'd have to deal with bishop takes h3, and it's a whole hassle. All right, guys. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye, everybody.